Hello everyone, welcome to my channel, and now we're going to look at another awful case with you, the Sumner family case buried alive. The deepest betrayal is that of a loved one who has experienced unending affection and trust. Despite the anguish, hatred, animosity, and disappointment, many people manage to cope and continue with their lives. But what if the treachery is discovered on the deathbed and the realization is the last thing a person experiences in life? That is the basis for the horrible Sumner family story. Even experienced criminalists with extensive experience were moved to tears by this case, except that the subhumans who committed this heinous crime, despite receiving an initial death sentence, are still alive and actively attempting to appeal the court's decision. But, let's start at the beginning and attempt to understand how it came to be that a little girl, whom Sumner's husbands loved and cared for as if she were their own daughter, decided to treat them brutally. James Sumner, sometimes known as Reggie, and Carol Alford met in high school and grew up in Charleston, South Carolina. They were the same age, had known each other from childhood, attended the same school, and were in the same grade. Their friendship and early attachment gradually turned into sympathy. The school children were unaware of how close they were getting. When the youngsters were 15 years old in 1959, they developed a romantic relationship and started dating. Friends commented on how lovely and harmonic the pair was, and later in life, James and Carol retained joint images of themselves as young, joyful, and ahead of their time, as if they were hoping for a long and happy life. It was the first time in their lives that they had intense and mutual feelings. The young people were almost inseparable, both inside and outside of school, and they seriously considered marrying as soon as they reached 18. Their parents approved of their children's decision and were not opposed to their marriage, but life had a totally different outcome: a long separation. The lovers graduated from high school in 1962, but they did not have time to marry since James was drafted into the Army a few months later. He and Carol decided to postpone the celebration until he returned home, and they also agreed to send each other regular letters. Time passed, the separation dragged on, and in the mid-1960s, the young guy was transferred to a hot area in Vietnam, after which contact with him was severed. Carol didn't sure if her sweetheart was still alive because he stopped writing to her. Carol opted to pursue her education while also working at the Charleston Air Force Base. She married a few years later, but her first marriage ended quickly, and the couple had no children together. The young woman married Richard Alford for the second time in 1975, and their only child, Rhonda, was born in 1977. However, the second marriage also failed because the husband misused hot drinks and frequently raised his hand against his wife. Carol couldn't take her husband's continual abuse and filed for divorce in the mid-1980s. But Richard did not leave his ex-wife alone. He literally chased her, attempting to ruin her life, and in 1987, he was successful. He purchased a revolver and ammunition, and after another huge drink, he proceeded to confront his ex-wife. Alfred rang the doorbell, and Carol unknowingly opened it for him. Rhonda, his 10-year-old daughter, was behind her in the room, but the intoxicated father was unconcerned, pulling out a revolver and shooting Carol multiple times in front of the youngster. He then got into his car, drove to a lonely area, pulled out his gun, and shot the remaining bullet into his temple, killing him on the spot. Carol was fortunate to escape because neighbors heard the sound of gunfire and the child's desperate cries and immediately contacted an ambulance and police. The young woman was on the edge of dying. She lost a lot of blood and was considered critical for several days. She underwent a series of complicated surgery and blood transfusions before eventually recovering. Except Carol went fully blind in her right eye and was left crippled for life. Her health deteriorated significantly around the end of the 1990s. She did not feel well, lost weight, and experienced significant discomfort and weakness. After undergoing a thorough examination in the hospital, she received a dismal diagnosis: liver cancer. As it turned out, in 1987, while doctors were fighting for her life, Carol's body mistakenly carried the hepatitis C virus, which she was unaware of and did not treat. As a result, the virus that infected her liver ravaged it for years, causing cancer. Carol's condition, however, was stabilized as a result of treatment and carefully chosen supportive therapy. She had to take her prescribed drugs on a daily basis for the remainder of her life, as well as have frequent medical checkups to make necessary adjustments to her therapy. Carol lost her employment at the Air Force Base after receiving serious bullet wounds. With cancer added to previous disappointing diagnoses, she was unable to work physically or stand for extended periods of time. So Carol accepted a position as a call center operator for a cable TV business in her hometown of Charleston. James, on the other hand, did not have the opportunity to report for quite some time after arriving in Vietnam. The fight continued on, and the man was gravely injured, almost losing his leg, and spent a long time in the hospital. His name was accidentally listed on the lists of the deceased, so even his relatives assumed he was no longer living. Sumner was fortunate to survive and come home years later. Carol's link has long since been severed. She had moved, married, and was convinced that her previous lover had died in a hot spot. James soon married, but due to his battle injuries, diabetes, and a variety of other chronic ailments, he was unable to become a father. A few years later, the marriage ended, and he has been living alone ever since. James took a job as a plain laborer on the local railroad, and he stopped expecting good surprises in life. The voice seems disturbingly familiar. Carol was going about her business as usual in the fall of 2000, answering phones and advising customers. When the young woman answered another such call, she recognized a voice that sent shivers down her spine. She recognized her first high school love right away, but she was frightened of making a mistake because she assumed James had died. Carol answered all of the customer's queries before suddenly turning to him and saying his entire name. There was stillness on the other end of the line until the man timidly asked how she knew his name. Carol burst into tears in answer, revealing that she was the girl he had dated in high school and had once planned to marry. For the next 5 minutes, they both wailed into the tube, unable to say anything. Then they discovered that they still lived in their hometown and decided to meet the next evening, 38 years later. According to Rhonda's memory, her mother arrived home from work that day delighted, looking like a lovesick schoolgirl and babbling incessantly about James. Carol prepared for her date the next day by trying on outfits and applying makeup. Carol understood she was no longer the young beauty James Sumner remembered her to be, but she still wanted to look attractive and win back the heart of the guy she had loved. It was an amazing meeting for both of them, as the pair had not seen each other in 38 years. They couldn't stop talking about anything in the world, sharing their pleasures and sorrows, failed marriages, work health problems, and memories of how happy they were together. Their old emotions surged up again. James and Carol were eager to make up for their lost years. They started seeing each other every day, and after a few weeks, they decided to move in and start living together. 5 months later, the pair married, and Carol relocated to her husband's home in the Riverland Terrace area, where she began her family life and encountered unpleasant neighbors. The pair first lived in their hometown of Charleston, South Carolina. They were in love, happy, involved in the details of daily life, and reverently cared for one another because they were both young and had health issues. James had known the Cole family for many years, and they resided next to the couple. Stephen, the head of their family, had also fought in Vietnam and was severely injured, forcing him to use a wheelchair. Natalie disappeared from work and did not hurry home, choosing to spend time with friends at a bar. Tiffany, their daughter, was left to her own devices. From an early age, frequently hanging out on the street with nothing to do and no money for even modest pocket change. Tiffany was still in high school when James and Carol moved in together, and Carol sympathized with the neighbor girl right away. She felt truly terrible for the schoolgirl, who was rejected by her own mother. Carol patronized Tiffany in every manner possible for 5 years, inviting her to her family lunches and dinners with excellent cuisine, buying her clothes on occasion, and even giving her money for little costs. Carol pampered her as if she were her own daughter, showering her with affection and attention. When the Sumners decided to sell their Chevrolet Lumina minivan in 2004, Tiffany inquired if she could pay for it in installments, because the girl had little money and needed the car like air. The couple agreed to give her the vehicle for next to nothing. They agreed. Upon amount was ludicrous, and it was divided into a dozen payments spread out over a year, resulting in a forced move and a strange disappearance. In early 2005, the Sumners decided to relocate to the sunny state of Florida. It was a forced action because both husbands' health had worsened significantly, and doctors recommended that they go south and closer to the seaside. They were both retired at the time, so they made the decision to make a significant life shift. Carol and James sold their huge Charleston house and purchased real estate in Jacksonville, Florida's largest and most populous city. They also bought a new Lincoln Town car. The couple was overjoyed and settled in their new surroundings, making plans for their future together. Carol contacted her adult daughter Rhonda every day and told her about everything in her life, including her feelings and plans. As a result, the kid was both astonished and excited when her mother did not call or answer her phone. One day in June 2005, Rhonda initially pushed the negative thoughts away and hoped that everything was fine with her mother and husband and that they would contact her back soon. But the following day, the situation remained the same. Rhonda contacted her mother and James' cell phones every half hour, but they were no longer available. The answering machine on her house phone went off, but all messages remained unheard. On the third day, Rhonda decided to drive herself to another state to see how her mother and stepfather were doing. She departed early in the morning and drove for almost 5 hours before arriving at Sumner's house. The absence of a car was the first thing Rhonda noticed, but it was far from the only abnormality. When the girl approached the front door, she saw that it was ajar. Despite the fact that the sun was shining brightly outside, the home was quiet and one of the rooms had a light turned on. Rhonda yelled out loudly for her mother and James, but there was no answer. Then she went into the kitchen, where she discovered a table set for two with food that appeared to have been there for at least 3 days. It appeared that the owners had met for supper, but had abruptly abandoned the meal and gone elsewhere. Furthermore, the house itself was disorganized, with items thrown about and several doors and cupboards left open. It appeared that something had been sought for. But what was it, and who was it? Some essential drugs were on the bedside table in the couple's bedroom. There were their mother's cancer medications, which she took 3 times a day, and a vial of insulin, which James took hourly. In addition, the couple's cell phones were entirely dead. Rhonda knew that without their meds and cell phones, her mother and stepfather would be unable to leave the house, let alone for an extended period of time. So she quickly called the police to report the event. Strange imposters. The couple and their automobile were instantly added to the wanted list, and Carol and James' bank cards were blocked the same day. The first few days of the search produced no results, and neither the summoners nor any witnesses on the trail could be located. However, on June 12th, many incidents occurred simultaneously, allowing the authorities to track down the culprits. First, a man called one of the banks and identified himself as Mr. James Sumner, complaining that his card had been stopped and that he was unable to withdraw cash. When the bank staff checked the card details, she instantly thought there was something incorrect. He offered Mr. Sumner to personally contact the nearest bank branch to resolve the issue, but the guy simply hung up. At the same time, almost a few minutes later, a woman called from the same number but was already in another bank, introducing herself as Mrs. E's, Carol Sumner, and reporting a similar problem with the card blocking. When requested to come to the bank in person, she flatly refused, claiming that she couldn't do so due to health issues, but that she was in desperate need of money right now and begged for access to her savings, which was of course denied. The information concerning the calls, as well as the recordings of the calls themselves, were immediately turned over to authorities. On the same day, they were played to Rhonda, who confirmed that the voices did not belong to her mother or stepfather. This was clear from the start, as both couples were in their 60s and their voices sounded excessively young. The authorities instantly suspected that the imposters were directly involved in the Sumners' disappearance, and that they had either kidnapped the couple and held them captive or killed them after extorting information regarding bank accounts and cards. The search several days later, the missing couple's vehicle was discovered abandoned on a remote road in a wooded location. There were no signs of blood or struggle in the cabin, but experts discovered hair and sweat markings on the trunk that belonged to both spouses. It became evident that the owners had been abducted in the trunk of their own automobile, and there was little hope of recovering them alive. When the authorities investigated the couple's bank transactions, they discovered that money had been removed from their cards multiple times after the Sumners stopped communicating with their daughter. After checking the ATM surveillance tape, it was determined that the money was removed by a young male who could not be identified. In addition, a request was made to track all calls from the number used by the imposters to call the bank. The SIM card itself, it turned out, was purchased without a contract and with prepaid time, soon before the spouses disappeared. It was not possible to determine the buyer's name in this case, but it was discovered that on June 6th, a call was placed from this number to a car rental firm. As it turned out, a guest at one of the hotels hired a Mazda Rex, 8 in the name of Tiffany Cole, and subsequently, an unknown young guy drove to Atoms and withdrew money from the Sumners' cards. He deducted $1,000 from the woman's card and over $3,000 from her husband's card. Investigators discovered that the previously stated Mazda Rex 8 was parked at a hotel in Charleston, thanks to beacons incorporated into all rental automobiles to track their whereabouts. A capture squad was immediately dispatched, and they physically broke into the room where the attackers were resting, enjoying their impunity. Young goons. The room was literally filled with parcels and receipts from numerous businesses, with purchases including clothes, gadgets, video games, cosmetics, fragrances, and a large amount of pricey alcohol. Inside were a girl and 2 boys who were plainly unprepared for police officers to arrive. Tiffany Cole, 23, her boyfriend Michael J. Jackson, 24, and 19-year-old Alan Lindell Wade were the 3 people involved. Handcuffs were snapped around the young men's wrists, leaving them looking astonished, perplexed, and even afraid. All 3 were transported to the police station and placed in separate rooms for questioning, although they initially feigned not to understand what they were accused of or simply remained mute. A search of the room revealed the Sumners' bank cards, a laptop belonging to the couple, some of Carol's jewelry, James' valuable coin collection, the keys to their Lincoln Town vehicle, and pawn shop receipts and the name of Tiffany Cole. As it turned out, Sumner missed out on some of the stolen jewelry, which Tiffany was able to pawn and spend the money with friends. Tiffany was the first to speak after several hours of interrogation and the presentation of the incontrovertible evidence discovered in the hotel room. The girl wailed and said that she and her pals robbed the elderly couple but did nothing further before fleeing and spending other people's money. She also revealed that they had another guy with them, 19-year-old Bruce Kent Nixon, whom they paid $300 for assistance and never saw again. As it turned out, Bruce truly consented to go to the crime for the promised fixed sum, and then he spent the entire amount on illegal substances. Finding the individual was easy because he lived in the same Charleston and had no intention of fleeing or hiding. He was detained directly at his parents' house due to a thoughtless phrase and a diabolical strategy. Bruce realized the consequences of his crime and agreed to collaborate with the authorities in order to avoid the death penalty. What the young offender said produced dread and frostbite on the skin. It all started in May 2005 when Tiffany went to the Sumners to make the next payment on the automobile she bought 6 months earlier. The girl always went to them personally since the gracious Carolyn James offered her to stay for a night or a few days, served her great meals, and even pampered her with gifts. If she came with guests, there was always enough place in the house and at the table. Tiffany arrived this time with her new partner, and both of them were graciously invited to dinner. Because it was late, the couple spent overnight at the Sumners' home. During the meal, the Sumners discussed how they had adjusted into their new home, and Carol accidentally mentioned that they had about $100,000 left over after selling their Charleston home, allowing them to live for themselves in their old age without depriving themselves or worrying about anything. Carol's words effectively doomed herself and her husband to death. Tiffany and Michael gazed at one another, and during the night, while at the couple's residence, they began to strategize how they would obtain this huge quantity of money. They said their goodbyes and returned to South Carolina, where they sought collaborators, allocated duties and responsibilities, and began to carry out the plan, which included horrible confessions from convicts. Tiffany leased an inconspicuous automobile on June 6th, while Bruce and Alan grabbed 4 shovels from somewhere. Together, they went to the Jacksonville suburbs, where they found a quiet area in the woods and began digging a deep hole that would become the Sumner couple's grave. Tiffany went to a hardware store on the morning of July 8th and purchased rope and duct tape, which she distributed to her accomplices. That evening, Bruce and Alan knocked on the door of the prospective victim's house, pretended to require assistance, and requested permission to make one call from their home phone. Carol felt these young men were unusual, but she invited them in anyhow, believing they needed help. When they got inside, they immediately attacked the helpless woman and her husband, who ran to her screams and threatened them with a fake gun. The couple's hands and feet were firmly bound with duct tape, blindfolded, and interrogated about money and valuables in the home. Under torture and death threats, the couple handed the intruders all of the information about their bank accounts and the PIN passwords for their cards, praying that their lives would be spared. However, as soon as the bandits obtained the essential information, 2 additional persons entered the residence. They helped drag the couple into the house's backyard and pack them into the trunk of their family car. Alan and Bruce drove the Lincoln and sat in the front seat, while Tiffany and Michael followed in a rented Mazda RX-8. In the event that they encountered a police patrol on the road who intended to halt the car with the couple in the trunk, the second automobile should have diverted their attention to themselves by accelerating sharply or flagrantly breaching the law. However, there was no one in their route, and both automobiles arrived at the scene safely. James was able to release his arm and remove the bandage and duct tape from his face, as well as his wife's face, so she wouldn't suffocate, but they didn't have any more time. What was their amazement, perplexity, and shock when the trunk lid lifted and the couple recognized Tiffany and her boyfriend, who had lately visited them. The Sumners were brought several dozen meters through the woods to a grave prepared for them, which they were forced into. The couple anxiously pled for their lives, but the young thieves decided to kill them in the most horrific way possible and bury them alive. According to Bruce, they covered them with earth for almost an hour, during which time the tired old people sobbed, expressed their love for one another, and bid goodbye. The couples died of suffocation, according to the examination, and fragments of earth from their mouths, respiratory systems, and even stomachs were discovered in their graves. After completing their horrific task, the robbers abandoned the Lincoln in the woods and returned to town in a hired car. They proceeded to Sumner's house and seized anything precious they could find before returning to South Carolina and spending the loot. However, after 2 days, the stolen cards were banned, and after another 4, all criminals were apprehended, tried, and convicted. Bruce Nixon was the only one who admitted his guilt from the start and decided to cooperate with the inquiry in the hopes of receiving leniency. He was the one who showed us where the couples were buried and told us everything that transpired that dreadful night. Tiffany said that her boyfriend Michael was the perpetrator of the crime, who had gone insane when he learned about the enormous sum of money that remained with the Sumners after the mansion was sold. Her lawyer argued that the girl was a wingman and had no direct involvement in the crime. Jackson and Lindell chose to remain silent, but the evidence spoke volumes for them. Tiffany Cole's innocence was not believed by the jury because she participated in the development of the criminal plan, rented a car, devised a diversionary maneuver in case they were suddenly pursued by the police, assisted in digging a grave for the spouses, and rented stolen items in the pawn shop and was happy to spend the money. This was demonstrated by a large number of images she took wearing the purchased clothes and in a limousine rented by the thieves to celebrate their accomplishment. As a result, Bruce Nixon was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while Jackson, Tiffany, and Lindell received the death penalty. The criminals sought numerous appeals and grievances, but all were denied, and their punishment remained unchanged, except that in 2023, 18 years after their heinous crime, the death sentence was never carried out. Thank you for watching, guys. Please subscribe to the channel and click the bell to not miss out on fresh stories from around the world. See you soon, and take care.